The 2025 International Colloquium Series Europe is sponsored by Union Theological Seminary in the City of New York, the Episcopal Diocese of California, King's College London, Regent's Park College, University of Oxford, the Center for Black Theology at Regent's Park College, Oxford, the Protestant Theological Institute of Paris, and in partnership with the Cathedral Church of the Holy Trinity, the American Cathedral in Paris.
The Northern California Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Community Foundation is dedicated to promoting justice, health, education, and service. Please consider making a donation at NorcalMLKFoundation.org. Every donation makes a difference.
Convening this event, I want to thank Dean Clark King. I also want to thank King's College and also the King Center. A whole lot of King going on right there. I want to thank you all for just being here with us today. And of course, I want to thank my respondent, Dr. Alexander Douglas. I look forward to continuing our conversation. We've been having a conversation about these things for some time now. And he knows more about music than I do. As I usually say, I don't play music, I play in the music. I used to be a breakdancer. I know I don't look like it now, but back in the day, okay? So I'm going to begin, and I'm going to begin with two quotes. The first quote is from Leonard Cohen, Canadian. I like that because, Canadians have a special kind of relationship with this country, and that raises a, little tension, and you'll see why that's important here. But I'm going to begin with the quote, and then I'll quote from Monk. Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offerings. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. The title, by the way, is Hearing the Light, the Gospel According to Thelonious Monk. Here's a quote from Monk. Anybody can play a composition and use 4 chords and make it sound wrong. It's making it sound right that's not easy. In this second quote, we find Monk, the composer, offering a key insight into how he creates songs with integrity. That is, a song sounds right. And that's not easy. To demonstrate his perception as a composer, I will outline 3 major points as a way to come to terms with the gospel according to Thelonious Monk. First, Monk developed the soundscape of his music with respect to a kind of dialogical tension. In this tension, he privileged the sound or coherence of a tune. And that way of privileging opened the door to his embracing tensions and allowing him to play freely in between tones and microtones. The following 2 points in this paper flow from this first point, which is Monk played inside the tradition and Monk played outside the tradition. So in composing, arranging, conducting, and performing his music, which are all part of a single musical architecture, Monk's melodic imagination becomes an analogy for those of us who would think in a radical theological direction, particularly in relation to Karl Barth, the grand Swiss theologian, and James Cone, the father of Black theology, who both wrote books, by the way. Barth wrote a book on Mozart, and Cone wrote a book on the spirituals and the blues. And so Monk, in my work, follows that work. Because jazz is our classical music, think Mozart, and jazz follows the blues. Come on, you see. And so I'll continue. This brings me to my first point, which is playing in the dialogical, harmonious thinking. Thelonious Monk, often called the high priest of bebop, which is a genre of jazz that had its heyday in the mid-1940s. It was a revolutionary movement tied to peculiar cultural and historical impulses. Cornel West identified bebop as, quote, a revolt against the middle-class jazz of the museum, against swing and white musicians whose styles had become culturally hegemonic. Bebop, in this respect, signalizes a period where a coming of age for Black jazz artists and Black people in general resonated with a cultural shift in mood. It was part of the zeitgeist. And Monk's predilection for playing bebop jazz then revolved around playing and dancing within contrasts, tensions, or juxtapositions. It is no secret that Monk was, quote, was interested in how things struggle with their opposites, close quote. And this playing within dialogical tensions is not limited to the way Monk played his music. It resides first in his mode of thinking about music, an approach I've come to call a form of hermeneutical musicality, or harmonious thinking. And you hear this thinking first in the aphorisms characterized by witty three-word phrases like, two is one, or discrimination is important. Now, regarding the latter, discrimination, he suggests that what you leave out of a tune is just as important as what you put into it. So the key to a good melody is not simply what you add, it's what you subtract, if you're going to improvise on it. Other phrases of Monk include play the melody or hear the light, which is two of my favorites. These statements and witticisms like it's always night or we wouldn't need light routinely set up tensions, contrasts, and incongruities that provide insight into Monk's aesthetic mode of thinking and the resultant stylistics that arise from that thinking. But also, they provide insight into an African-American aesthetic mode of religious apprehension, which then shapes what it means to do theology in the mode of Monk. Monk's approach to tensions, contrasts, contradictions, and contingencies can be heard in how he listened for music. Yosef Komunyika, the poet, describes well Monk's way of listening and its relationship to his melodic imagination. He says this, Monk's music requires an active listener, someone who doesn't have to be told the whole story. For there is an emotional elasticity in Monk's world. Things that seem at odds with each other often fit side by side. The human mind does the framing, and then he says this, inside and outside of conventional references. In this respect, I agree with those who argue that Monk's conception of music is not something that grew out of what he felt was a need for something new in music. He just played it that way. His ear was hearing between the lines of its own accord, and his non-conformist ego told him that what he heard was perfectly valid. This is what I admire most about Monk, Miles Coltrane, Charlie Parker, Mary Lou Williams, and so many other jazz greats. They played their music their way. They were not, in the words of Toni Morrison, quote, preoccupied with the white gaze, close quote. This reminds me of an article by Cornel West, who describes another bebopper named Charlie Bird Parker. The title of that interview is called Charlie Parker Didn't Give a Damn. And his point is that Parker was being active and not just reactive. He was being constructive and not just polemical, playing his music his way. Thus, this form of radical subjectivity, which one writer identifies as Monk's individuation, situates Monk on the subjective side of Karl Barth's objective interpretation of Mozart's music, and on the objective side of James Cone's subjective participation in the spirituals and the blues. In other words, it places him on the inside, meaning in between the cracks, where the light gets in, dancing around the objective and the subjective. Listen to Karl Barth's objective description of Mozart. He writes this, Mozart's music is not a personal confession. He does not reveal in his music any doctrine, or certainly not himself. Mozart does not wish to say anything. He just sings and sounds. Thus, he does not force anything on the listener, does not demand that the listener make any decisions or take any positions. He simply leaves him, or the listener, free. And Barth often routinely talks about Mozart's free objectivity. Okay? But that's Barth's interpretation of Mozart and reflects Barth's theology. By contrast, James Howell Cone, the father of black theology, stands on the other side of Barth. Now, for your information, Cone did his master's thesis and dissertation on Barth. First two books in black theology influenced by Barth. A lot of people don't know that, but I'll continue. What Cone aims is that he aims to emphasize existential and subjective insights. When describing, for example, the spirituals and the blues, a book representing his most important turn in black theology, he writes the following. Existentially, this is Cone, the subject matter and focus of this book have been defined by the black musical forms which have influenced my life. I've written about the spirituals and the blues because I've lived the experience which created them. I affirm the reality of the spirituals and the blues as authentic expressions of my humanity, responding to them in rhythms of dance. I therefore write about the spirituals and the blues because I am the blues and my life is a spiritual. And then he says this, without them, I cannot be. When we hear this juxtaposition, without being in strict contradiction, that is, between Bart's interpretation on one hand and Cohn's participation on the other, speaking in terms of an emphasis or accent. Now, don't dogmatize the binary, okay? Don't dogmatize it. It's an accent. It's an emphasis. Monk, however, as noted earlier, troubles these categories, plays in the surplus, and provokes a kind of mindfulness, of playing or framing with themes that, quote, that seem at odds with each other, fit side by side, close quote. In his melodic logic, Monk inspires a mode of thinking in and around Bart's objective and Cohn's subjective orientation. This is why I note in another context that Bart turns Schleiermacher upside down, Cohn turns Bart inside out, and I go round and round in a hermeneutical circle. And for those of you who caught that, you might have upside down, inside out, round and round. Upside down. Boy, you turned me. Anyway, let me move on. Because Monk inspires, as one writer notes, a disharmonious harmony in his music, and hearing, thinking, composing, and performing this way, Monk can play a composition using far-out chords and make what sounds wrong sound right. This is why I appreciate Monk's aphorisms and his challenging us to hear the light. For one must immediately come to terms with the fact that you're working with a mixed metaphor. For we do not hear light, we see light. In the Western mode of thinking, however, we demand that our ideas be clearer, more rigorous, craving a kind of exactitude. We moderns have received a heritage where we think, know, and see, not hear, believe, and dance, even if we call ourselves postmodern. The African-American aesthetic mode of religious apprehension, however, has become indispensable for me, because through Monk I've become fascinated with an oral aesthetics, A-U-R-A-L, with an aesthetic mode of religious apprehension that frees or liberates our thinking from categories that tend to overdetermine and circumvent the critical, creative, and constructive power of Black religious imaginations. This kind of religious freedom corresponds with the view of Charles H. Long, the historian of religion, who argued provocatively, now that's not in the book, this is what they always say to me. He would say that a theology of freedom first begins with a critique of theology as a powerful mode of discourse. If you don't begin there, you're messed up. You got to deal with theology first. It is a freedom that sustains us not just in our Exodus experiences, I think of Cohn there, but also in our exiles. In case you haven't figured it out, Americans are enduring an exilic experience right now. And Black Americans have been experiencing that for a much longer time. Thus, in turning to Monk's oral aesthetics, we find a witness to a form of rhythmic tension and repose, musicality and technique, tradition and innovation, structure and spontaneity, point and counterpoint, sounds and silence, and they all play a part not merely in Monk's musical improvising, but hopefully in our theologizing. And with a little bit of phenomenological imagination, if Monk's music is used as a medium, Monk's hermeneutical musicality can be a gift to our theological thinking, both inside and outside the traditions we inhabit. I turn now to Monk playing on the inside of tradition. This brings me forward to the second point. Monk not only requires active listeners, Monk makes a second demand on his hearers. He surprisingly compels hearers to familiarize themselves with tradition. On our last occasion, I noted that he played the pass with his left hand and innovated with his right. Monk always played in relation to stride music. And so he used his left hand to play stride, and he kind of innovated with the right hand. But the truth is that his appreciation for tradition is implied in his whole compositional approach. Thelonious is third, in fact, in a line of three great composers that include Jelly Roll Morton and Duke Ellington, who, as an aside, and I have to say it to you, sometimes you take up time for things that are important to you. And when Ellington met Queen Elizabeth in Leeds, who was fascinated with the meaning, he composed a record for her called the Queen's Suite in her honor. This record was not pressed for sale until after Ellington's death. The point is that the record was for her listening pleasure only, because Duke Ellington was a true Duke, noble, elegant, and classy. I just thought I'd tell you that. Monk, nevertheless, as a composer, follows in this musical tradition. Martin Williams, a jazz critic, insightfully portrays jazz history as reflecting a kind of gradual evolution in rhythm, swinging like a pendulum from innovation to form to innovation to form. Sort of like Monk, for those of you familiar with Bart, sort of like Bart's regular and irregular dogmatics. I could say more about that later. In Monk's innovative approach to jazz, however, innovation is found in form. And Monk carries, extends, and signifies on previous forms. And then through tradition itself, creatively addresses thematic developments associated with black cultural forms. Monk takes, quote, traditional material personally reassessed and brought up to date. He is editing and transmuting. So on the one hand, he is composing in a tradition, and on the other, he is innovating in relationship to it, dancing a little to the side without being outside. Dialogical tension on the inside. Here I agree with Stanley Crouch, the poet and cultural critic, who argued that quote, Monk's music was so far in the tradition that he seemed to demand that the hearer have a thorough enough knowledge of the African-American legacy to appreciate how he was playing around with it, off of it, and through it, close quote. Signifying. Theologically, Bart interpreted other theologians in a similar mode of discovery, using a method he called, or he described as, interpretatio in bonum partem milium, or optimum partem. This means interpretation in a good, better, or best way. Extracting the best and therefore the most useful parts. In this way of reading his predecessors and contemporaries, Bart also made fiduciary commitments to the past, gaining insight even from their oversights. Perhaps Alexander McElway is correct when he describes Bart's approach as a teacher and what I hear as distinct Monkian overtones. He says this: when Bart interpreted a theologian in terms of the best parts of her or his work, he was affirming the fact that no system of thought is so enclosed by error that it cannot also speak, perhaps even in spite of itself, a meaningful word to the church. And I believe he was asserting that not only his view of Scripture and not only his understanding of the incarnation can yield useful reflections of the faith, but that the whole tradition, with its various systems and all their parts, is capable of such articulation, if one would but look, and I say listen for it. Okay? Close one. If one would hear the light, I suggest, we can also, along with Bart, hear James Cone, who once stated that, quote, with all brilliant insight, there is some blindness, close quote. For Cone was always, as he notes, here's another quote, searching for ingredients to put in my own view of the gospel and the black liberation struggle. He continued. He said, Bart, Tillich, Bultmann, Bonhoeffer, and other Europeans were merely the tools I appropriated in order to say what I believe was the truth of the gospel, as defined by the black experience. Close quote. In this I hear Bart and Cone, like Monk, deliberating over each moment, pensively agonizing for the right sound. So this lecture is designed not to explicate Bart in order to clarify what Bart is doing. It is designed to implicate Bart in relationship to Cone to clarify what I'm doing. You stay with me on that. This is Monk mode. Okay? It is not an apologetic move. It is a proleptic turn, agonizing to articulate a tradition on the inside, moving it forward and bringing it up to date, signifying. I believe that this movement to be already at work in the family kinship between Karl Barth and James Cone. But when we bring a Janus-faced Monk to the conversation, Monk was believed to be Janus-faced. That means looking in two directions at once. And when you bring that to the conversation, one plays ambidextrously, looking in two directions, past and future, Barth and Cone, creating a movement within a movement. That's how Monk is described. Then unity and community are found precisely in the affirmation of our differences. And the willingness to dance in the tensions and juxtapositions of our traditions in an age of uncertainty. Monk's way of attending to the tradition and the transition, transmuting and improvising on it while making the best of it has had a fundamental functional effect on my theology. But Monk doesn't just play on the inside of tradition. He plays on the outside of tradition. This is my third point, final point. This brings me to perhaps the most demanding and liberating part of Monk's musical aesthetic. To understand how Monk could work so pensively on the inside of tradition, which allowed him to innovate so openly, spontaneously, and joyfully on the outside of tradition, we must come to terms with how Monk, quote, revives the traditional idea of basing his variations and improvisations directly on the melody, close quote. Monk embraced the melody of a composition as the center, the cantus firmus. It's a term that Bonhoeffer used. We'll talk more about that later. So when composing a song, he organized his harmonies and rhythms around the fixed center. And it provided the coherence of a tune. And being a melodist, like Ellington, who was in the tradition before him, this emphasis distinguished Monk from other beboppers. In fact, he was described as the only bebopper who never really played bebop. At the same time, his innovation on this tradition made all the far-out chords sound right and all the possibilities and variations meaningful. The melody was the key, just as the divine melody is the key for the theologian. On this point, others wrote of Monk that the way that Barth writes of Mozart. Quote, Monk places technique at the disposal of music, but he does not dazzle us. Indeed, he does not show us anything. He can take the simplest note and make it count in every way because he knows the musical worth of each sound he makes and the silence he allows. It sounds sort of like that reading of Mozart. In the passion of the moment, he may even strike a note in mistake. But we all know none of this distracts. Close quote. Why? This is me. Why is this the case? Because Monk as a medium brings into song. Because Monk as a medium brings into song and relation, ideas into song in relation to melody. Because the note is what it is because of the melody. Just as in Barth's description of Mozart, who, quote, creates music from a mysterious center and so knows and observes limits to the right, the left, above, and below while he maintains moderation, close quote. Likewise, Monk, moving on the whole notes of the white keys, share his bent notes, his harmonic cluster, his silences, his spaces, his rests, all surrounding the cantus firmus with respect to a kind of free objectivity as Monk improvises on the melody. On the other hand, Monk expresses for his own individuation, manipulating the black keys, sharps and flats. He can highlight the melody by subtracting and distilling as effectively as others add to it. Think of Art Tatum, and then you can go later and listen to Art Tatum and his embellishments. Just brilliant. The wrong notes are his choices. The silences are his. The melodic fragments, the harmonic clusters, the rhythmic displacements are all part of Monk's melodic imagination. He embraces the harmonic and the rhythmic tension. He ventures off the beat, then on it, then back off of it. He zigzags, loops around, bends a note here, leaves a note there, over there, suggesting, while all the time anticipating his own melodic goal, well in advance, leaving tensions unresolved. Sometimes until the last possible minute, go back and listen to Mysterioso when you get time. This means, for Monk, the means and the ends cohere. What counted above all else for Monk, at least in performance, is rhythm, but rhythm in relation to melody, because it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. Okay? In this kind of liberated subjectivity, we find Monk here closer to James Cone, but still in between the cracks, contributing to the meaning of the divine melody in all of its subtle shades. According to the jazz baroness, and we'll talk about this later maybe, he could hear the music around the music, exploring all the possibilities one never dreamed of. Like the hearing of a soundscape in nature, or viewing the beauty of Hampstead Heath, the rolling hills and the woodlands, or gazing on a lovely constellation. Monk was attuned to all the sounds, colors, and shapes. There is so much to love. Perhaps this is why the jazz tradition never became a form of traditionalism for Monk, and why theological tradition should never become a traditionalism for the theologian. I'm reminded here in saying this of the brilliant quote by Jaroslav Pelikan, who in his classic volume on the Christian tradition stated that tradition is a living faith of the dead. Traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. The more I tune to Monk, and I'm wrapping up here, the more I tune to Monk musically, the more the possibilities expand theologically, expanding and becoming more multidimensional. When the mystery of the melodic center is privileged as an analogy of the divine, spiritual and even political possibilities can be developed more robustly in light of the assumptio carnis of the incarnation. Arguably most appropriately in that sequence for Barth. A more comprehensive divine, however, can unfold in possibilities that accompany the complex nature of human life through what I call a free pneumatic counterpoint, where extra church realities and the word of God heard, and this is a term from Barth here, extramuros ecclesia, meaning outside the walls of the church, are set in relief more clearly. And what are those words? Folklore, spiritual, blues, hip-hop, and other modes or styles of life, they become more consequential for the analogical imagination. And this kind of attunement, especially in an African-American aesthetic mode of religious apprehension, relativizes the role of more nationalistic forms of Christianity, or our overdependence on personal piety, or religious leaders, and even the religious imagination. We become more free to attune and attend to the insights of artists, poets, novelists, and other creators. And this preoccupation with Monk constantly begs the question of what this would mean for theology. What does this mean for us hearing the light in a world around us that's becoming more one-dimensional, it's becoming more polarized, and the freedoms we share are becoming more diminished, darkened by the naturalization of war, the rise of fascism, and the impulses of aspiring dictators in the world? What does a dialogue between Monk's constructive compositional approach and creative melodic centering say to our analogical imagination in such troubling times? What does hearing the light in its angularities, dissonances, registers, harmonic clusters, fragments, refractions, rhythms, reharmonizations, melodies, and counter-melodies, what can they suggest to us? Can these things represent more than just musical architecture? Can they represent the polyphony of voices speaking in our world? My friend Willie Jennings asked, and this is in the foreword of my book, not being gratuitous here. What does it mean to live through a song, or a drum beat, or a bass guitar riff, or a chord progression, or lyrics that capture a stubborn dilemma? And who would find it necessary to do that? The answer, Willie says, to both questions is black folks and black life. This, however, Willie says, is not a racial exclusivity. This is the way of all flesh, enfolded in a world of trouble. But I say this, can they represent even more? Can we hear the voices of traditions, institutions, social systems, curricular interests, protocols? If we as theologians would honor the dialogical relationship between Bart's Mozart and Combs, the spirituals and the blues, between the dogmatic categories and concrete human experiences, and hear the light of the gospel, according to Thelonious Monk, then the rhythms we share, even in the academic industrial complex, conceals the same paradoxical significance that many institutions conceal in this age of uncertainty. Indeed, in the economy of redemption, I'm suggesting that we not only hear the gospel in doctrinal statements or the reiteration of creeds, we will hear it in a renewed religious imagination. One second here. We will hear it in a renewed religious imagination. We will hear it in the depth, diversity, complexity, and richness of the actuality of black religion. In work songs, spirituals, blues, and jazz. We will hear the light in the songs and the testimony and prayers of those who marched during the Black Freedom Movement. The Spirit's witness will sound in the Black Power movement, as James Cone noted. In the Black Lives Matter movement, in the Me Too movement, the symphonic witness will sound in the cries of the prisoners and the poor. In Ferguson, Ukraine, Israel, and Gaza. It will sound in student encampments when they critique universities, and sound in universities when they critique state power. And in all of these things, in all of these voices, we will hear the light. We will discern the voice of God that resounds in every moment, in every place, where freedom for humanity in the world resounds. This freedom for humankind and other kind, if we hear the light of the gospel, according to Thelonious Monk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. So 5 things, if I can remember them, which I will not talk about, unfortunately. What it means to hear the light, and in this case, what somebody who doesn't do music, much less jazz, for a living, can bring to conversations. Music is too big to be left to the specialists. Theology is too big to be left to the specialists. We're not going to talk about hermeneutic musicality, only because there's nowhere near enough time, but what Monk is doing there and what Raymond is beginning to explicate needs its own conversation. We're also not going to talk about Alexander McKelvey quote, which is huge and bombshell. And we only live once. So, in thanking Professor Carr for these extraordinary and timely provocations that we experience not only in this paper, but in the academic trilogy, Please Invest, that has recently come onto the market. I now propose to bring fire from this side of the pond in no uncertain terms. Now, this conversation does not need, I'm saying this carefully, US-style hagiography, because Raymond's work is worth far more than that. Let's raise the stakes. My personal reflexive stance is informed by an extremely negative view of the current state of musical theological discourse as currently practiced by both white theologians deploying colonial aesthetics, whilst often claiming otherwise, and by black theologians, not all of them, but some of them, for sure, who are currently reinscribing multifarious forms of intellectual imperialism. And so this response is its own act of resistance in rigorous solidarity with my big brother Raymond, whilst also hoping to show how this conversation will progress in ways he himself, God bless him, may not have seen coming. Now, melody was central to Monk, but his improvisations were also characterized by distinctive rhythmic and harmonic elements. His use of unusual chord voicings, dissonances, and rhythmic displacement contributed to his unique sound. Furthermore, Monk's compositions often featured motivic development, where small melodic ideas were rhythmically and harmonically transformed throughout a piece. So although melody was a focal point, Monk's improvisational style was a holistic integration of melody, harmony, and rhythm. Now, such an argument exists to the effect that, and I'm not saying that Raymond did this, focusing solely on melody and analyzing Monk's improvisation would ultimately oversimplify his complex musical approach. His innovative use of rhythm and harmony played a significant role in shaping his sound, and isolating one element might not, will not, capture the full essence of his artistry. Now, while I know Raymond understands this, my pedagogy in this context requires me to state categorically for the record that contrary to what you will hear from certain music scholars and writers, Monk's improvisational style cannot be confined to a single element. And so successfully understanding Monk's artistry requires an appreciation of how these elements intertwine to create his distinctive sound. So, at the heart of this response to Raymond is the following argument. Thelonious Monk's artistry can indeed serve as a rich case study for articulating an anti-racist and anti-colonial conception of what I would hereby characterize as aesthetic cognition. That is, a form of knowing and world-making expressed aesthetically, but also socially and historically situated against colonial logics of reason, form, and normativity. Aesthetic cognition refers to how aesthetic practices, in this case music, in this case jazz, participate in and generate modes of thought. Not just feelings, not just expression, but thinking that isn't reducible to formal logic or empirical scientisms, as well as empirical science. In anti-colonial and black radical traditions, this kind of cognition resists the multifarious violences, plural, of abstraction and epistemic capture. And I'd like to argue that few musical oeuvres are better placed in Monk's corpus to serve as case studies for resisting colonial norms of reason. First suggestion, non-normative logics. Monk's music violates classical Western norms of harmony and voice rhythm. But his music thinks. It explores and exposes the very constraints that Eurocentric music theory wants to universalize. This is aesthetic cognition against coloniality. the aesthetic as a form of knowledge that undermines imposed and assumed universals. Second, temporal and rhythmic disruption. Monk often plays behind or against the beat, refusing the metronomic time that capitalist modernity and its musicologies so often idealize. This can be read, for example, in certain ways through thinkers like Sylvia Wynter or Luis Ferreira da Silva as a refutal of chrononormativity, an anti-colonial reconfiguration of time itself. Third, melodic obsession and the refusal of ornamentality. Monk's melodic focus isn't decorative, it's ontological. And this is not in the sense of Victor Anderson, so everybody is clear. Melody becomes the vehicle for refiguring identity, world, and history, not a layer to be added after the real, harmonic, and formal structure. This is crucially non-assimilationist. Monk doesn't prove black genius by mimicking white musical grammar. He distorts, bends, folds, often by using its very tools against it. So let's widen the frame of reference. If we take Fred Moulton, for example, what we might characterize now through Monk as black performance functions as a kind of fugitivity from capture, where the aesthetic actually succeeds in becoming a site of political thought. From another direction, Lewis Gordon connects music and black existential life as forms of philosophical anthropology. So he would say, I'd suggest, that being and knowing don't begin from post-Cartesian rationalism, but from dispossession and resilience. But Raymond is also connecting us to what George Lewis achieves in that seminal text, A Power Stronger Than Itself, where he situates black experimental music, AECM and others, as cognitive practice, world-inventing, anti-colonial, and rigorously self-determined. So the implications for anti-racist and anti-colonial theology are huge. We need to resist, I'm suggesting this morning, epistemic extractivism. So we should understand that Monk resists being turned into an object of analysis by Western theory. As Raymond shows us, Monk's work challenges us to theorize with, rather than on, him. This also requires us to understand and then follow Adorno and Horkheimer in resisting multiple modalities of universalizing, because an anti-colonial aesthetic cognition doesn't seek to universalize its grammar. It is grounded, historical, fractured, and entirely profound as a result of all of those things. Thelonious Monk's music is not only aesthetically radical, it is cognitively insurgent. His approach to melody, rhythm, time, and form offers a non-colonial epistemology in sound. This is what aesthetic cognition can mean when rooted in black freedom struggles, a kind of thought that neither begins nor ends with what Europe counts as reason. Hopefully somebody remembers what Raymond said about Charles Long in his paper. Getting towards the end, in traditional Western theology, from Augustine through Schleiermacher to Barth, melody has often been metaphysically elevated. It is taken to symbolize unity, linearity, and divine order. Think of the line as a journey towards eschatological resolution. In certain theological aesthetics, not least, for example, Jeremy Digby, the leading figure in music theology, melody is interpreted as narrative coherence, a sonic analog for Christological teleology, movement through time towards fullness, resurrection, and meaning. We don't have time for me to drop a Derridian hammer on that, if only. But this is a deeply Western Christian trope, historically yoked to tonality. We should talk about how François-Joseph Fétis, the most important name in the history of Western tonality itself, actually did not believe that anybody other than white Europeans were capable of creating art. Counterpoint and goal-directed, telos-directed harmonic motion. So all of this doesn't just miss the point of what Monk is doing, it also enforces the metaphysical grid that risks recolonizing Monk's music by forcing it to mean within a logic alien to its own aesthetic production. Ethnomusicologists, especially since 1980 or thereabouts, have been showing that privileging melody, especially as linear pitch progression over time, is a culturally specific idea rooted in European classical music, not a universal principle. It is often used as a civilizational benchmark against which African, Asian, and indigenous music forms were deemed to be primitive because they emphasize rhythm, texture, cyclical forms, or heterophony instead. Now, there's no way that Raymond intends this, but the way in which that discussion did situate melody at that moment would potentially risk, I'm saying this wasn't what he intended, but where we misprocess, not least because we don't understand the phenomenon of music itself, we are only going to be at risk of reproducing the same valuative hierarchy that 19th century elitists and colonial theorists used to other non-Western musical traditions. And so Raymond is now about to discover at the same time as all the rest of you that as both a jazz musician and a proud black musicologist and theologian, I would in fact suggest, in response to section 3, that Monk is radically committed to what today I will characterize as anti-melodicism. Now, Monk did care deeply about melody, but not in the straightforward romantic linear sense. Rather, Monk's melodies are often angular, fragmented, and at times intentionally non-singable. They emerge frequently out of rhythm, not the other way around. Monk plays with the form of melody to destabilize expectations, not to affirm them, so there is a risk in privileging melody in a theological reading of Monk that would involve misreading his compositional method and failing to grasp the counter-hegemonic work his music does, its resistance to being consumed, resolved, or theologized within colonial auditory forms. I have yet to hear a paper involving jazz and theology on this side of the pond which has not done exactly what I have just said. No exceptions. So given the following, I hereby articulate the prospect of a decolonized theological aesthetic in which melody is not presumed to be normative, but is rather interrogated as a vehicle of European metaphysics. Theological thinking now listens against itself, which is to say that it becomes self-deconstructive, learning to hear rhythms, silences, disruptions, and asymmetries as theological gestures in their own right. And as such, Monk is no longer made into a theological object, but he challenges theology itself in its epistemologies, its musical presuppositions, and its aesthetic political unconscious. This would require us to understand my final point. Sound, not simply as melody plus harmony plus rhythm, but as rupture, refusal, and, after Derrida, spectrality. Thank you, Raymond, and all of you, many thanks for your time and attention this morning.
Thank you so much to both of you. Fantastic. I think you're already living some of the dialectical tensions inside the tradition between you. Fabulous. We'll take a couple of moments for questions before we move on to our next pair, if that's all right with everyone, just to bring in some more voices and some more counterpoints. Would anyone like to pose a question to either of our speakers so far? Or to both of them together, if you like. I have a question. Is that nearly a hand? Yes, Ben.
It's just a throw another question. Thank you both so much for that. To throw another consideration into the mix, Alex, I'm picking up on your contrast between the decorative and the ontological. Might that be a binary also to questions somehow, that actually being is decoration in some way? Decoration goes all the way down, and what we're involved in being part of the world is, it's another way of putting the decoration is the gratuitous, and grace is a grace nature question. Grace in a way is more fundamental, or nature is a form of grace, so that decoration is our deepest ontology, something like that.
Okay. Should I use the microphone or?
Yes, I'll pass it back to you.
Sure. Oh, for the recording. Sure.
Scuffle back.
Sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That's a genuinely important question. What's a succinct answer? So, obviously, there is something that the Balthazar has contributed to this conversation. I think that's super important, but also super complicated. And while I point rather than digging into, I think this might be a moment to, rather than sort of engaging in a superficial and malicious level disavowal of the ornamental, talk about, and the Black Atlantic is now, I think, peculiarly important, the challenges of affect, A-F-E-C-T, vis-a-vis effect, E-F-F-E-C-T. So, a concern in terms of how we might interpret the historical trajectory of, let's say, African American gospel music in relation to Southern gospel music, and its ties to the previous canons of Black and white spiritual theological conversations, might be to say that, for example, the moment Woodbury Hamilton Jr. questions the way in which Kirk Franklin, a famous gospel artist, claims to have the Jesus rock that people need, not understanding the enormous problems in making an assignation between gospel music as both effect and affect, and the practical endemic of both there and here at that time, what might be the effectively transformative becomes reduced to the short-scale superficial, no performative, the ornamental, then it is not that it stops having the power to be more than simply ornamental, but at the same time, purposefully, non-purposefully, it does become a mechanism for replacing that which would be matters for transformation with a sort of transfigured sort of holograph. And at that moment, I think, the question becomes super important, because rather than simply saying, here's the binary, which would be a risk for sure, the idea would be to say, now both of those polarities themselves are the beginning of a conversation, rather than an end. And so thank you very much for that question, which should be able to show how the hermeneutics of that are more than just the words I said.
I would just respond to that really quickly. One of the things that, in my work, Charles Long used languages of ontology, and others use language of ontology. The question is, what do we mean by ontology? Right? So if you read James Noel's book, Black Religion and the Imagination in the Atlantic World, he's talking about Black being as non-being, certain kind of non-being. So you got to understand the acoustics of darkness to understand Black being. So what do we mean when we use this language of ontology? I don't make those kinds of distinctions, because really to treat monk, you almost have to approach monk phenomenologically, right? You're not going to come to monk in an abstract. You gotta be at Minton's. You gotta be into the music in some way. And so I'm not wrestling with these questions, even though I'm working at the hermeneutical level at this speech today. I'm not addressing that, but I deal with monk in terms of Christology in the second book, where I do look at melody. I look at it as asymmetrical and discontinuous. So I'm not pushing any notion of it being some kind of abstract form throughout history. So just.
Thank you. Another question from Alira.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation, the talk, and the response. I'm interested to know if Monk says anything about pneumatology. You mentioned in your presentation about Black existential life, I think towards the end, as a way of all flesh. And I found that quite intriguing. And I wondered if you can kind of say a little bit more about that, and if you have any insight. If Monk doesn't say it, have you got any insights into how the Spirit of God feeds into this kind of conversation at this space? Please, yeah.
Appreciate that question. Monk says very little religious at all. Monk is doing jazz, right? He did travel with an evangelist as a young man who was in the, may have been in the Pentecostal tradition. But even when he was playing there, he was talking about a certain kind of groove. But that's precisely why I chose Monk. For me, biblical faith is not about being religious, it's about being radically human. But being radically human includes the religious things that you do and God properly situated. So that when I look at this, when you see me using Monk, I'm using almost a non-religious source. And when I call Monk an icon of the eschaton, I'm adding him to being called an icon only because of the thought he produces. Sort of like if you're looking at someone like a Jean-Luc Marion in his book, God Without Being, right? The icon is coming from a thought, it's producing one. And so I treat Monk as a jazz artist, nothing less, nothing more, but he can be an analogy for theology. So when you read the very first section of my book, the preface, I kind of frame that out. So you can see that I'm using this analogical language without changing jazz from what it really is. Right? Or needing to be a jazz artist.
Absolutely.
Right? Because some people who are not jazz artists feel the music better than some jazz artists. So
I understand. Thank you very much about Monk, but what about you?
okay.
What insights into the...
In terms of pneumatology?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so I think that, so I'm dealing with two theologians, Karl Barth, James Cone, who are both Christocentric theologians. There's no question about that. They just have two different emphases, right? And Cone, when he's doing it, and sometimes he gets mistreated because of this. I'll say that Barth, for instance, improvises on the melody. That means he's focusing on a Christological concentration. But James Cone improvises on the melody. Right? That's on the other side. The same line, but they're both connected. I use that as not only a kind of a way to address their Christological concentration, but to address a Chalcedonian understanding of theology. And watch this. What I bring to it in order to have a conversation with them is a pneumatic counterpoint. I want to use the idea of the Spirit as a way of having a conversation with them to take it into these conversations that make it more radically human. So that's where pneumatology comes in for me. Now, I don't even use language, for instance, like there's this language, and I'm going to say this really quickly, of spirit Christology, because it's too encumbered with other people's baggage. So I just say pneumatological Christology or pneumatic counterpoint. And so that's my way of talking about spirit, which I'm headed toward in the last book. Thank you for that wonderful question. All right.
Emily. This will be our last question.
This is a question for Professor Raymond Carr as well. I'm just wondering if you think that Monk, you mentioned that he serves or he can serve as kind of food for analogical thought. So I'm just wondering if that works not only theologically, as you've suggested, in relation to freedom, but also anthropologically. Does it work to say he's also expressing, acknowledging, potentially confessing human fallibility? You mentioned kind of this idea of being Janus-based, and this going back and forth isn't just about, a pure, like, divine unity, but it's, something else needs to be happening.
That's a wonderful question, yeah. In fact, I was emphasizing what you're saying, but pointing to Cone. So between, and this is where the problem comes in sometimes in theology. That's why I was saying, don't dogmatize the objective and the subjective. Right? Because in between that is this wonderful surplus. And there's a way in which Monk's music opens the door to, when I think of dissonance, I think of secularity. I think of brokenness. I think of all those, and by the way, Barth talks about this in volume 431 of his church dogmatics, paragraph 69. He said even pagan sort, all this stuff should not be dismissed, but the reading we've typically heard from people like that has been a reading that plays down those possibilities. So when you hear me say extra church, that includes exactly what you're alluding to. Radical humanity. Doesn't have to be religious at all. And I think what's my goal? My goal is to get Christian church, Christian people to open their eyes to the possibilities in the world. I think we need to have a much more animated vision of the world. I'm just using the language of voice amongst the language of music to articulate that vision.
Thank you so much. I think a further round of applause for our speaker now.
The International Colloquium Series, confronting global issues with moral clarity and intellectual depth.